letting people get online for the webinar now. And we're just going to hang tight for a minute or two and let people join, and then we'll be starting very soon. My name is Dave English. I am with the Midwest Comprehensive Center and the American Institutes for Research. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Saucony Davis and Mara Shanfield. And we also have some folks from the Minnesota Department of Education on the line with us, including Greg Keith. Greg, hi, how are you? Greg is going to be joining us for at least one slide in a little bit, so I'll let him get his audio sorted out there. But we will jump right into it. Today we're going to be talking about online resources for identifying evidence tiers for evidence-based practices. And I want to go through a few housekeeping items with you real quick to make sure we're all set up correctly. If you're still working on getting your audio dialed in, we recommend that you select the dial out feature in the Adobe Connect platform to let the software call your phone. And by doing that, you'll have the best format for both receiving audio and jumping in with responses. This is in opposition to selecting the listen only option. So again, use the dial out feature for the optimal experience here. And also please remember to keep your audio line muted while you're not speaking, and you can do that by manipulating the speaker icon, the green speaker icon at the top of the screen. Again, this is the second in a two-part series. Last week we kicked things off with a webinar that really focused on identifying evidence-based practices that meet the minimum requirements for Tier 3 for low-performing schools. And today we're going to go beyond that. We're going to dig into Tier 1 and Tier 2 a little bit more, and really it's going to culminate in a section on mastering these different online resources for identifying evidence of all tiers across at least 3 or 4 different online resources depending on how much time we have. So we're going to divide the discussion into 2. The first part will again be a discussion of the criteria for the evidence tiers, and we'll go beyond Tier 3 to talk about some of the criteria we didn't address last week. And then in part 2, we're going to do a deeper dive into what the Works Clearinghouse resources. And as time allows, I'm going to show you some other clearinghouses that have evidence-based practices in them. A couple of other things to note. You will see italics throughout the presentation. Wherever you see italics, that's going to refer to different criteria for the evidence tiers. And by that, I mean the criteria that are in this handy table that is, you can also view on the screen here. You see a table that says ESSA evidence tier criteria, and we're going to be going through each of these 7 criteria. That's what the italics maps to. The second symbol you should be aware of is the circled numbers. Whenever you see a circled number in the right-hand corner of a slide, you know that it's referring to a specific criteria, and those numbers are going to map to these numbers on the evidence tier criteria table that you see, that you're always going to see up on the screen. So you can always look at those numbers and map them to the criteria you're looking at. We will be emailing this handout out to everybody. If you didn't see webinar 1, we will be emailing webinar 1 and all the handouts as well as webinar 2 and all the handouts associated with that to everybody. We're going to be doing that through Minnesota Department of Education by the end of the week so that they can email those resources to you guys directly as soon as possible. And trying to get my camera going here so that you guys can see what I look like for better or worse. There I am. Wow, that's a big head. All right, there we go. That's better. All right, I don't think I'm going to necessarily be up the whole time, but now you see my image and you can picture me when I'm talking, so that's a good thing. All right, so let's get started on this. So we know that the ESSA requirement that's driving this conversation today is really all about this requirement here, that at least one practice in CSI and TSI schools must meet evidence tier 1, 2, or 3. I don't need to go into it in depth. You guys are familiar with it already, but basically any CSI and TSI school must have a practice that demonstrates statistical significance and is based on either strong, moderate, or promising evidence, which corresponds to the ESSA tiers 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to go in depth about what those different tiers mean right now. I'm going to put myself to the side there. I'm a little bit distracting. So the first question is, where do we find evidence-based practices, right? Somebody says, okay, you have to find some evidence-based practices that you're going to use. So what does that mean? Well, basically, you can go into one of 3 sources. You can look at online clearinghouses that compile these evidence-based practices and evaluate the research studies. And we're going to show you a few of those today and provide a list and a guide of additional resources. You can also look at individual research studies on your own if you are so inclined. You can go into sources like Google Scholar or ERIC, the ERIC database, which has a lot of education studies, and actually look at individual studies, which is a little more advanced, but we're going to give you some tools to start doing that. And then finally, related to that is you can actually have single study reviews commissioned by the IES, by the Institute of Education Sciences. You can do that by talking to the Minnesota Department of Education, or you can talk directly to us, and we'll provide some contact information at the end of this, at the end of the webinar. But one key point here is that whether the practice you're thinking about doing is just continuing a current practice that you've been doing, or whether it's new to you, you have to find evidence that meets the tiers. You can't simply rely on past experience with the current practice. To that point, I do want to mention that we're going to be discussing the MERS early warning system a little bit later in part 1, because we know that it's a current practice you guys have been using, and the Minnesota Department of Education is going to address how that aligns with the tiers. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So let's talk about the criteria specifically. Last week we got into the minimum criteria for meeting Tier 3. So I'm going to blow through those as well here just to reorient everybody and for anybody who wasn't in the first webinar. But we are going to focus to a certain extent on all the criteria that we weren't able to hit last time. But first, let's answer the question of why Tier 1 and Tier 2 are important, right? Many of you may have been on that first webinar and said, okay, I got what I need. I know that I need to do this to make sure a practice at least meets Tier 3. Now, why would I care if something is Tier 1 or Tier 2? Why is that even important? Well, from a compliance perspective, you're right. We gave you what you needed in webinar 1 to comply with the law. But there's some very good reasons for being interested in Tier 1 and Tier 2. And the main reasons are that they embed requirements and criteria that have to do with the fit of the practice with your targeted student population, right? So certainly you wouldn't assume that a practice that works in urban schools is going to work in rural schools as well, right? And certainly you wouldn't assume that a practice that works for non-English learners works for English learners, right? And yet Tier 3 doesn't address that. So Tier 1 and Tier 2 are really going to where you're going to see better alignment between those types of issues. And then secondly, the good reason is that Tier 1 and Tier 2 identify causal relationships. And by that we mean that they can determine definitively that a practice has actually caused an outcome as opposed to simply being predictive of an outcome or correlate with an outcome. And we'll get to some examples of that. The important thing to know is that it's obviously, you can use a practice with a significantly higher confidence level when you know that it's actually the cause of an increased outcome as opposed to it merely predicting an outcome and not being quite sure whether the practice itself is the direct cause of an outcome or if it's just related to it. So we'll get into that in a little bit of detail. All right, so let's talk about criteria number 1 and criteria number 2, which are research design and group equivalence. And again, follow along with the evidence tier criteria table that's in the other section of your screen, and that'll help ground this conversation. So we talked a bit about this last webinar, and we know that for studies in tiers 1, 2, and 3, they all measure a relationship between a practice and an outcome. Okay, the practice might be a dropout prevention program, and the outcome might be an increase in graduation rates. The practice might be instructional adjustments that impact an outcome like increasing achievement score increases. But as I mentioned, that relationship is different for the different tiers. Any study that's determined to be tier 1 and tier 2 is going to have a causal relationship, right? The practice directly causes the increase in the outcome. And for correlational studies, we can only say that we know that the practice is predictive of the outcome, right? We don't know for sure that it caused it. And I'm going to rehash the same example I used last time just to burden in your brains, which is that let's take a region where the rainfall increases drastically, and then people go out and buy raincoats for the first time, and then the next day everybody's skin is very itchy. You wouldn't say that the rain caused people's skin to be itchy, right? The raincoats caused the people's skin to be itchy. But you could say that the rain correlated with the itchy skin. That's the difference between causation and correlation. And obviously you could see why causation would be a much more valuable relationship to uncover than necessarily correlation. So why are tier 1 and tier 2 studies, why can we say that they're causal? Well, the reason is that they build on the building blocks of a tier 3 study. Remember that the tier 3 study does measure a relationship between practice and outcome, but tier 1 and tier 2 studies both assign study participants to control and treatment groups, okay? And then tier 1 study goes one step beyond that and actually randomly assigns participants to a study. And by embedding these types of design controls into the research, that actually helps to facilitate the determination of a causal relationship. Here we see, so again, I just mentioned that experimental and quasi-experimental studies both have control and treatment groups. So I want to just unmute the lines here for a second, and we'll also let you guys chat about this. Who can tell me what a control and treatment group actually are? So this is the first question I'm posing to you, so I expect the answers to trickle in slowly and for people to speak up a little bit slowly, but if you know, as you know from last time, I will wait it out for you guys to put something in the chat box. So you might just kill the suspense by immediately chatting the answers that are coming to your mind. Starting you off with a relatively easy one. What's a treatment group and what's a control group? I see somebody typing. One brave soul is typing at least. People, multiple attendees are typing. I like to see that. Exactly, and I'm seeing all the correct answers pop up at once. A treatment group receives the intervention or the practice, while a control group does not get the intervention, does not receive the practice, right? And the reason for doing this is that you need a baseline. You need a baseline performance so that you can compare the treatment to the status quo, to business as usual. So already you're introducing more rigor into the research design and advancing up the tiers by introducing this element of treatment and control groups. Now the way they differ that I mentioned is that if the control and treatment groups include random assignment of participants, then that meets the experimental or the tier 1 criteria, right? So if you have random assignment, if a coin flip if the participants are assigned based on a 50-50 chance, like a coin flip, then that is considered more rigorous. And the basic type of research that has this approach is going to be called randomized controlled trials. So whenever you see the phrase randomized controlled trials or RCT in the language of a study, then you know that you are very likely looking at a study that meets that tier 1 criteria for criteria number 1. Again, we're just talking about criteria number 1 here, which is denoted by the circled numeral in the top slide corner. As I mentioned, tier 2 or quasi-experimental studies have non-random assignment of participants to treatment and control group. What does that mean? Well, there are various statistical methods that a researcher can actually assign participants to control and treatment groups that are a bit technical to get into, but basically you just need to know that it's not a random method of assignment and therefore not considered as rigorous and would not meet the tier 1 criteria. Here are some different types of quasi-experimental studies. Time series, non-equivalent groups, matching. We don't want to get into that. That would be a rabbit hole. And frankly, it's not important for you to fully understand these methods. What's important to know is just there are lots of ways, aside from a random controlled trial, that can be used to assign participants. If it's a random controlled trial, it's very likely it's meeting the tier 1 criteria. If it's not a random controlled trial and it's one of these other types, it's very likely that it's meeting the tier 2 criteria for this criterion 1 around research design. And as we went into in some depth last time, in order to meet the tier 3 criteria for research design, the research simply has to be correlational. Right? This means that there is not a control and treatment group, right? There's no randomization. There's literally no purposeful creation of control and treatment groups. Again, statistical methods are used to control for bias, but you don't use that purposeful assignment of control and treatment groups. I showed you last time that if you look at a results table like this one on the screen, which has the practices on the left or row dimension of the table around participation in advanced placement, participation in concurrent enrollment, and outcomes arrayed along the columns, that you see a quantitative relationship where those dimensions meet in the middle, and you know that that's measuring the magnitude of the co-relationship. But again, you're not going to see any information about the assignment to control and treatment groups. The final word on research design is that in general, you need to be cautious of using undocumented results as the justification for using a particular practice, right? You can't rely on your experience. You have to find a study and or number of studies to back up the experiences that you've had. You can't use typical program evaluation results, which are often not rigorously designed. Why? Because state staff don't have time to sit around designing extremely rigorous studies. It's actually very difficult to do, and so often program evaluation results designed by state or local governments won't meet these tier requirements. Qualitative research that just describes or observes a certain phenomenon in education and maybe attaches categories to that will not meet the tier criteria. And finally, be very cautious of unpublished research or research that has not been peer reviewed. Again, all of these types of research very likely may not have the design embedded in them that would meet any of the criteria for tiers 1, 2, or 3 to meet that criteria 1, okay? All right, so moving on to criteria 2, and then I'll pause for questions really quickly. Criteria 2 is around something called group equivalence, and very briefly, it deals with another aspect of how participants are included in studies, all right? We see here that for tier 1 studies, there has to be low attrition of participants. For tier 2 studies, you can have high attrition, but then there has to be what we call baseline equivalence. And then finally, for tier 3, there merely needs to be statistical controls for bias. So let's talk about what all that means. So group equivalence, we know that to meet tier 1 for this particular criteria, criteria number 2, a study has to have low attrition. So all that means is that a study has low participant dropout from the time that the research starts to the data analysis in order to qualify for tier 1, right? So when we think about students participating in a study, what might be some reasons for why they might drop out from the time the study starts to the end of the study? It's a very intuitive question. Whatever you're thinking right now, type it out, say it out loud. I'm sure you'll be at least 75% correct when you do so. Moving, yes, students moving, exactly. Students changing schools. Yes, illness. Students passing, of course, dropout, pregnancy, right. Reasons for students missing schools. Are there any more technical reasons that might not have to do with the student himself or herself and their presence or absence that might be related to attrition and whether or not you actually have data for a student at the end of the process? Yep. Changes within the school, getting stuck in the system. Exactly. What if a teacher changed? Sure, absolutely. There may be other factors not related to the student that change that invalidates a particular group of students that we're going to use. So there could be other factors at the school. Here we list a few of them. You've mentioned a bunch of them, the students transferring, et cetera. But there's also reasons related to researcher procedures like having inconsistent or missing data, right? If for some reason the researcher's computer blows up and they lose a file, that may be one reason for attrition. They just accidentally lose data for a group of students. So there are lots of reasons that might be behind attrition. Here's the technical definition, just as an FYI. Experimental studies, in order to meet criteria number 2, must have low attrition and low differential attrition, right? So overall attrition referring to all all of the participants and differential attrition, referring to doing taking the difference between the attrition in the control group and the attrition in the treatment group. So two different types of attrition that need to be looked at there. Now, I'm not giving you mathematical formulas in this presentation because, as I mentioned, part 2 is going to show you how to navigate online clearinghouses. And I'm going to show you some shortcuts that are going to explain, that are going to signal to you whether these attrition and other criteria are met. So don't worry too much about knowing these mathematical formulas, et cetera, involved. Looking at Tier 2, we know that in order to meet criteria number 2 and to meet Tier 2, you have to at least have baseline equivalence. So what do we mean by that? For baseline equivalence, we mean that the comparison and treatment group participants are equivalent on key factors like race, achievement, at-risk status, etc. What does that mean? It just means like the average student characteristics for the control and treatment groups have to be roughly the same. You need to have roughly the same number of African American students, roughly the same number of students with disabilities, etc. So again, there's a mathematical formula behind that I'm not going to show you because we're going to show you some shortcuts to that later on. But now you at least know what that means. Finally, we know that for Tier 3, the minimum requirement is that we have statistical controls for bias. I went through this in detail in the previous webinar, so I encourage you to look at that. But basically what this means is that if you do not have low attrition and you do not have baseline equivalence, at least the researcher needs to have these statistical controls for bias embedded. And that's done by including statistical factors around race, gender, age, etc. Or it also could be school level controls, right? Urban, rural versus suburban schools. And in the last presentation, we showed you a few examples, and I'll just put one up here right now, which is that, again, referring to a table of results that you would find in a study with your outcomes in a column, as you see here, which is enrollment in a Minnesota college, and different practices in the rows. You see participation in concurrent dual enrollment, etc., in some rows. But you also see these controls, which are also known as covariates. Whenever you see these results tables with different student characteristics like Hispanic, Black, English as a second language, etc., you have a good sense that the experiment, that the study is indeed controlling for bias, and that it's at least going to meet Tier 3. All right, so those are the three different tiers for the first two criteria. So I want to just pause there and see if you guys have any questions. Make sure you guys are tracking how I'm taking each of the criteria in due course, and how the numerals track with the table, etc. I don't see any questions, so that's good, but please just shout them out. All right, great. I'm going to keep moving here. So let's talk about criteria 3 and number 4. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because we went into this in depth in the last webinar. But as we see here, the criteria are the same for tiers 1, 2, and 3, right? The criteria are that you have at least one study with a statistically significant favorable effect, right? Usually that just means a positive effect on the outcome. And that at criteria number 4, there's no significant unfavorable effects from a tier 1 or tier 2 study by outcome. Right? And what those two mean together are simply that you have at least one study that shows statistical significance, and you do not have another study that shows a negative statistical significance, right? Because that would cancel out the first study. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what those two mean. Again, a statistically significant favorable effect means that there's a 95% or higher likelihood that a relationship between a practice and an outcome is not random. And by not random, we mean, again, either a predictive relationship, or also called a correlational relationship, or a causal relationship. We talked about those two different types of relationships. And because you guys already got this material, which I will hit in a second, I want to just keep you on your toes a little bit by giving you one more practice example. I'd like you guys to look at this example and just tell me which of the relationships here between the practice and outcome meet the statistical significance criteria for tiers 1, 2, or 3. Right? So which of these relationships demonstrates statistical significance? So if you could find the practices and find the outcomes first, make sure you have a good sense of what the practices are and what the outcomes might be. Look for the statistically significant relationship and tell me which of these relationships have statistical significance. This is the hardest question of the morning, the afternoon rather. So you're going to be coasting after this. All right, 2 people typing. If you can't or don't want to answer that question, you can at least respond to what the practices are and what the outcomes are, and I can start talking about that just to make sure we're on track here. People are still typing. A number of people are still typing. Still typing. Wow, I'm getting some very sophisticated answers, I think. Yes, so I'm seeing correct responses around what the practice and the outcome are. And yeah, and I see people identifying at least one correct relationship. I've gotten a couple answers saying that there's a statistically significant relationship between dual concurrent course and enrolling in 4-year. That is indeed a statistically significant relationship. Why? We see 3 asterisks at that relationship, which has a 0.29 magnitude. And when you look at the footnotes, you see that it has a p-value of less than 0.01. And as I'll remind you in a second, that denotes statistical significance. The magnitude is not important. 0.29 has no importance to us for our purposes today. That does discuss the magnitude of the relationship, but for purposes of statistical significance, that magnitude is not important. All we're looking for here is the asterisks. So I'm looking at some other responses here. Let's say both concurrent AP courses are statistically significant for 4-year enrollments. Other people, AP courses and enrollment in 2-year college. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So AP courses and enrollment in 2-year college are indeed also statistically significant. You see 2 asterisks there at the negative 0.23. However, what's the issue with that one? We see a negative symbol, okay? So in this case, because we're looking at coefficients and the relationship, the negative symbol is generally going to connote that this is not what we call a favorable or positive relationship, okay? So even though you see the 2 asterisks there, you see a negative symbol. So that's going to be a big clue to you that this particular practice is not having a favorable or a positive outcome. Also, we see a single asterisk at the relationship between taking at least 1 AP course and enrolling in 4-year college, where the numeral is 0.46, where the magnitude is 0.46. We see a single asterisk there. This is not statistical significance, and this was a trick question. Haha. The reason for that is that the p-value here is not low enough. We see that for a single asterisk, the p-value is less than 0.1. Oddly enough, there are many research studies out there that include p-values or statistical significance for the 0.1 level. However, that is not universally regarded as statistical significance. It's usually included because the researcher might not have as strong results as they want, and so they're at least showing you that there's some level of statistical significance. But for our purposes today, you need to see a p-value of 0.05 or less for statistical significance to be met and for this criteria to be met. We know that 0.01 is less than 0.05, right? So 0.01 meets the criteria and 0.05 meets the criteria. And there was one question around whether or not the p-values are listed in the table. No, they are not. That is the one distinction that you need to be clear on. The magnitude is listed in the table of the relationship. Here you see 0.90 circled in this results table, but the magnitude is not relevant, right? What's relevant for our purposes here is that you don't have a negative symbol, right? That the relationship is positive, and you see that 0.91 in this table is positive, and that the asterisks denote a statistical significance that is 0.05 or less. In this case, you see a single asterisk, and the footnotes at the bottom are your guide to the p-values, right? So the tables don't contain the actual explicit p-values. They only contain the asterisks that map to the footnotes that contain the p-values. So the lesson here is look for the asterisks, look for the footnotes, make sure the p-value is less than 0.05. 0.1 is not going to be a p-value that has statistical significance. And the other clarifying piece I'll say about this is that 1 minus the p-value is the likelihood the relationship is not random, right? So in other words, if your p-value is 0.05, you subtract it from 1, and you get a 95% likelihood that the relationship is not random. That's your threshold for significance. If you think about 0.1 and subtract that from 1, that's a 90% chance that the relationship is not random. And that's not a high enough percentage that they're not random. All right. And Dennis from MDD is actually pointing out that sometimes statistical significance is listed in the tables. Good point. You may have an extra column here next to each of these outcomes that could actually make that explicit, or it could be noted in some other way. If it's there, great. If it's not, look for this here. All right, I think I've belabored this point, so I'm going to move on here. But that's an important one. The second point around significance and our criteria number 4 is that there's no significant unfavorable effect from a Tier 1 or Tier 2 study. Again, what this means is that there are no other studies besides the one you're looking at that found a negative significant effect, right? It's not good enough that you have a positive significant effect. You need to ensure that there aren't other studies out there that show with significance that there is actually a negative effect between the practice and an outcome. That is tricky to do without the help of these online resources, so we're going to do that. But if you are doing an individual study review, just know that you need to make some sort of good faith effort to make sure that there aren't other studies out there that refute the evidence for the positive results that you found. I'm seeing questions and other seeing other comments coming in that are all making excellent points. The asterisks are not necessarily formatted in the same way across studies, and it's very easily to get confused with the number of decimal points. You know, keep your 0.1s straight from your 0.001s. Just look very closely at those and make sure you're not mistaking the two. Any other questions about criterias 3 and 4? Again, we did a closer review in webinar 1, so check that out. But otherwise, the requirements are the same for tiers 1, 2, and 3. All right. Great. So I'm going to go over criterias 1, 2, and 3, or 5, 6, and 7 now, and then we'll get into the actual online resources after that. These are pretty straightforward. The criteria are that for tiers 1 and 2, there is a large study sample, that the study is conducted across multiple sites, and that there's some overlap between the characteristics of the students in the study and the students in your school or your district, and or that there's some overlap between the setting of the study and the setting of your district or school, okay? We'll talk about what that means. So specifically, a large study sample means that there's at least 350 participants in the study. I'm going to show you how to find that in the online resources, but one important point I'll make here is that sample size can
and I think Emily needs to put that as, because she has a whole bunch of rhymes, not a whole bunch of my favorites.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm getting a question or not. It sounds like it's not a question, but if you are, if you want to be on mute, go ahead and use that mute button at the top. If that was a question, either chat it for me or restate it because I didn't quite catch it. But the sample size, again, needs to be at least 350 students. And an important point about that is that the sample size can be aggregated across multiple studies. In other words, if you find one study that has positive results that has 250 participants and doesn't meet that threshold, if you have another study that has positive results and has at least 100 participants, you can aggregate that and say, okay, there's at least 350 participants across 2 different studies, and therefore that criteria for a large study sample is met. Criteria 6 is that it's a multi-site study sample. I'll just tell you right now, 95% of studies are multi-site samples because the bar is relatively low. It's that favorable effects are found in at least 2 or more schools, right? So if you find positive results, you just need to make sure that the study describes a research design that includes at least 2 different schools of students. Most studies have more than that, but again, 2 schools or 2 districts, 2 states, etc., and you've met your multi-sites study requirement. Finally, the last requirement is around sample overlap. And what's important here is that for Tier 1, in order to meet Tier 1, there has to be overlap between the study you're looking at and the population of your own school or district along the student characteristics and the setting, right? If you only meet one of them, then you can qualify for Tier 2. So what do we mean by the population or the student characteristics and the setting? I've said it multiple times, so you can either say it out loud or chat it. What are some characteristics of the population, and what do you think I mean by school setting? I welcome your chat answers or shouting out loud. Yeah, seeing some answers coming in here. Student characteristics around race, gender, socioeconomic status, exactly. Balance similar demographics. And for setting, we're talking about urban, rural, suburban setting. Exactly. Ethnicity, gender, school demographics, suburban, urban, exactly, you got it. So the point here is that to meet Tier 1, in order to meet Criterion 7, there has to be overlap between these different population characteristics in the setting. In other words, if you are trying to apply a study to all students, you should not look at a study that only addresses English learners and apply the lessons from that to your to a practice for all students. Same thing for setting. If you have results from a study conducted in rural settings and your school is urban, you're not going to meet, you may meet one or other criteria, but you're not going to match on the setting, right? So you're not going to be able to meet Tier 1 because there's going to be a misalignment there. We did have one comment here expressing some fear that the criteria around a multi-site study may limit studies to a certain extent to large publishers, to huge grants, to studies that have a lot of funding. And I would say that there could be a correlation between that and the number of sites that you include in the study. I think this question was referring to criteria 6. But I would say that the bar is actually quite low for criteria 6. Again, the bar is simply that the study was conducted across more than one school. And most well-designed research studies are going to be conducted across more than one school. Research such as a study that's conducted on one school may have a program evaluation, maybe a program evaluation, and may qualify for Tier 4, which we're not going to get into today. But yeah, the bar is that the research is conducting at least 2 studies. So getting back to criterion 7, though, we see that, again, this is a relatively straightforward criteria to understand. When there's overlap between population and setting, you can qualify for Tier 1. If it's only one or the other, then you can only qualify for Tier 2. So I just want to summarize what we went through really quickly. You can look at this slide for a quick summary of the bars for each of the criteria. Remember that Tier 1 and Tier 2 studies measure causal relationships, which is their biggest advantage over correlational studies. And we know that Tier 1 and Tier 2 studies are going to use control and treatment groups that are either randomly assigned or otherwise. They're going to have low attrition or baseline equivalence, which is going to make for a more rigorous study design. They're going to have favorable statistical significance that is not overridden by some negative effects from any other studies that are Tier 1 or Tier 2. And actually, I'll pause just to say I didn't stress this enough. At criteria 4, the negative effects need to come from a Tier 1 or Tier 2 study specifically, right? So that means if you find negative effects for a Tier 3 study, that's okay. That is not deemed rigorous enough to override the positive effects that you find otherwise. So Tier 1 and Tier 2 are important qualifiers for criterion 4. And finally, criteria 5, 6, and 7 are all about having a sample size at least of 350 students and there being at least some overlap between the student characteristics and the setting. I'm going to pause in a second, but I want to show you one more important slide, which is a decision tree for walking through these criteria. So we're giving you the criteria in a couple ways here. You have the table number 1 to 7 that shows you a checklist format, but you also have this decision tree that also embeds the criteria. And you can just walk through these yes-no decisions, and it'll actually point you to the correct tier by answering these questions in order. And this is particularly useful if you're doing a single study review or something like that. I want to call out one important fact that I want to really leave you with. If you look at the criteria table on the right, you see that criteria 1 around design rigor describes the minimum rigor required. What that means is that a Tier 2 study could be an experimental study or a quasi-experimental study. A Tier 3 study could be experimental, quasi-experimental, or correlational. The research design noted here is simply the minimum research design needed to meet the tier criteria, right? And you see that expressed in this decision tree, right? So if you start at the top all the way to the left with a design that has experimental, you see that if you get to your first question around low attrition and it doesn't have low attrition, you see that the decision tree kicks you over one tier to the quasi-experimental, and you continue answering questions there. And you may end up on Tier 1 or Tier 2, or none of those, right? So again, for criteria 1, that research design just represents the minimum research design there. All right, so now that we have gone through all of the criteria, we're going to get into the online resources in a second, but I want to cue Greg Keith and or his team to please address one issue that we left off talking at the end of the previous webinar, which has to do with the Minnesota Early Indicator and Response System, or MERS. There's some questions around how it aligns with the evidence tiers. And so Greg is going to discuss that real quick with you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's staying warm today. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm just going to say welcome to everyone. Dennis Duffy's here with me, and Dennis is actually going to speak to the question that was raised in the last webinar. I will just comment, Dennis sent out an email as well to all directors yesterday, so many advocates may have received that prior even to this conversation. So Dennis?
Hey everyone, just wanted to kind of follow up with that email. In the email we linked to a specific IES randomized control trial that we used with Midwest Comp Center to develop the guidance around MERS. MERS is an example of an early warning indicator and monitoring system, which the evaluation evaluated the core components derived directly from that study. So if you want, take a look at the email, take a look at the study and the material that I sent along with it. I'd also recommend for folks who looked at the description in the practice guide and were wondering, oh my God, is MERS minimal evidence? What's going on? We mentioned this on the webinar, and I took a follow-up look. I'd also recommend not only looking at the description of the practice, but also going into the core components of recommendation 1 in the dropout prevention guide, but also recommendation 2. I found that when I looked at recommendation 1, I wasn't seeing a lot of the core components that are outlined in early warning systems. But if you look at recommendation 2, you're starting to see a lot more of the core components, like set up a point person to follow up with individual students, have a menu of options for interventions, monitor the system, all of which are described in those early warning systems. So wanted to point that out, but your directors got an email. Hopefully they passed along. And as always, if you have any questions, you can follow up with myself or Greg, and we'd be happy to take them. So over to you, David.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. All right, so what we're going to do now with the remaining time is we're going to explore some of the online resources available. We got into the Works Clearinghouse a little bit last session, and we're going to dive deeper into that. But we're also going to take a look at some other clearinghouses. I do want to mention here that we have created a guide to various online resources that the Minnesota team is going to share with you very soon. We're in the process of finalizing it, and they'll be sharing it out, and it's going to have a lot of different key information about each of these resources that are listed here as well as probably a couple more. And they'll include some links to the resources specifically and describe what's in each of these different online clearinghouses, etc. But right now, I want to get into them to kind of help build your confidence around using them. Because they're not difficult. Once you do them, you'll see how simple it is. It's just a matter of having the confidence to look for the different criteria embedded in the different descriptions of the studies. But importantly, none of the clearinghouses right now align perfectly with the ESSA tiers. In other words, there's no flag in these descriptions of research that say, this is a tier 2 study, use me. Unfortunately, that's not in there. However, at least in the case of Works Clearinghouse, they are actually working on that. And it's anticipated that at some point this year, not in the near future, but I can only say at some point this year is what I'm hearing, they will specifically tag studies with tier levels in Works Clearinghouse. But for now, you have to actually just kind of look for the different clues for how they meet the different criteria, which is what we're going to show you. Remember that if a practice is in these clearinghouses, it doesn't mean that they automatically meet any of the tiers, okay? You still have to look at the information for each of the research studies to determine which tiers they meet. Some analysis is required. And if you really want to become an expert on this, if you're going to be doing this for the long term, there is some Works Clearinghouse training available, and if you click on that link there, it'll take you to it. It's pretty lengthy. It's at least 8 hours, I'd say, but I did it, and look at me. I'm presenting this to you. So there you go. It is valuable if you want to dig into it. So first I'll review Works Clearinghouse real quickly, specifically the Find What Works database and the educator practice guides. Let's look at the Find What Works database first. And to do so, I'm going to hone in on criteria number 3 and 4 first. So if you have the criteria table in front of you and you can print it out or even put it on a dual screen, you might want to do that because I'm going to do some internet surfing here, and I think the table is going to go away. But for now, for the first thing I'm going to show you is how to make sure you know that criteria 3 and 4 are met in the Works Clearinghouse. So I'm going to transfer over and share my screen. And I'm now sharing my screen. And if one of my colleagues can just let me know that you can see it, I'm going to jump into how to navigate this site real quickly. So this is the cover of the Find What Works Clearinghouse. And the first thing you'll see is different portals to getting into the summaries of research. You can either enter them by outcomes that you're interested in, such as literacy achievement, or you can enter them by the approach to your practice, such as improving teacher quality. For our purposes, we are going to go into literacy. And the first thing that I want to show you is that you can actually filter by multiple topics, right? So I searched on literacy, but I could also click other filters here. I clicked English learners, and so we see that there are multiple interventions that address literacy with specific context for English learners. All right, so that's one way to narrow your search for different practices, which are called interventions in Works Clearinghouse. I'm going to keep it broad here on literacy for the moment. Let it reset real quickly. So I'll just give you a quick orientation to what you're seeing. You're seeing all the different interventions that the Works Clearinghouse has evaluated for different tier levels. The ones nearest the top have the greatest statistical significance. You see a different symbol here, this gray book, for interventions with lower statistical significance. So already you see that you're getting some clues around how to look for statistical significance in the Works Clearinghouse. we're going to go into the leveled literacy intervention. And the first thing that pops up on the landing page is different outcomes, right? I've talked a lot about the relationship between the practice and the outcome, and this is where you start to see the rubber hit the road here a little bit. This row is describing the relationship between the intervention and the alphabetics outcome, how well students are doing on the skill that is called alphabetics. The second row describes the relationship between the intervention and the reading achievement outcome, right? So you have different outcomes, and you have the effectiveness rating, which describes the statistical significance between the practice and the outcome. Specifically, it describes both criteria 3 and criteria 4, right? Which are about whether the study, which is about whether at least one study has positive statistical significance, and whether there are other studies which have refuting evidence that have negative evidence that is significant. So the key for looking at the effectiveness rating is that out of the 6 indicators on this band here, you see the band here with 6 different symbols in it, a negative, a negative, a 0, etc. The top 2 ones qualify you for meeting tiers 1, 2, or 3. If the top 2 symbols are not indicated, then you know that you will not meet tiers 1, 2, or 3. So in other words, when we look at reading achievement, we know that the intervention meets criteria 3 and 4 for statistical significance for the reading achievement outcome. Similarly, the intervention meets the statistical significance criteria, number 3 and 4, for reading fluency here. All right, I'm just going to back out of the presentation real quickly to show you a couple of slides that are getting to that point. Which is that the first 4 bands in that those 6 symbols indicate that the intervention is not eligible for tiers 1 and 3 for that particular outcome. But if the second 2 symbols are selected, we know that the intervention is eligible for ESSA tiers 1, 2, or 3 for that outcome, right? And we know that the criteria, again, are the same for each of the tiers. So it doesn't matter. The distinction between the tiers is not important. All right, so I reviewed that in detail in webinar 2, so you can look there for more detail on that. But I want to keep this moving and show you the shortcuts for determining criteria 1 and 2 in the What Works Clearinghouse. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen with you. Thanks for bearing with me for while I do that. All right, so now for criteria 3 and 4 around statistical significance, we were able to determine that from this screen. But to determine criteria 1 and 2, study design, you actually need to go into individual studies. All right, so we need to drill down into a row here, and we see that the row aggregates results across 2 different studies. In order to look at criteria 1 and 2, we actually need to drill into one of the studies. So I'm going to drill into this first study by Ransford. And looking at this landing page here, we're going to see the important clue to meeting criteria 1 and 2, which is this badge here. If you see a badge that says meets WWC standards without reservations, that means that the design standards for criteria 1 and 2 are met without any concerns, and that the study can be considered for tier 1. All right, so the key phrase here is meets WWC standards without reservations, and that's embedded in the slides that you're going to receive. So let me go back and just show you an example of something that has a different rating. If we go into Knowledge is Power program, the KIP intervention, and I drill down into the ELA outcome. Again, this is all sorted by outcome, so you have to have your practice to outcome relationship in mind. I'm going to go into the first study, which is a Tuttle study, and I see here that it says meets WWC standards with reservations, all right? So this is a slightly less rigorous study. They're saying that it meets design standards in general. However, there are some reservations. There are some concerns. And if you look at your tier criteria, you see that a study that meets WWC standards with reservations only is going to qualify as high as tier 2, okay? And that's embedded in your PowerPoint that you'll get, all right? So I'm going to keep it moving and show you how some other criteria are found. So I'm going to show you now how criteria around sample size and multi-site studies are met. So this time I'm going to go back into level literacy intervention, and I'm going to go into the reading achievements outcome level. Actually, I'm going to stay at this level real quick and show you that you can start to see sample size information immediately. All right, so from this screen, you see a students column, and you see the sample size right here, 747 students. All right, so already you see that you have 2 studies that aggregate over 350 students, right? You have a single study that is 427 students. So you know already by looking at this study that you're going to meet that 350 student threshold, all right? But there's other ways you can look at this as well. If you drill down into the study, you're going to want to go into the sample characteristics, right? Again, we talked about overlap between the sample characteristics and the setting. And here, when you go into sample characteristics, you're going to see different demographic information and different setting information, all right? You're also going to see study details. If you go into study details, you'll see information that's very similar. The study took place in 5 rural elementary schools in Georgia, all right? So already you see that you're meeting your multi-site criteria. You're conducting the research in more than 2 schools, excuse me. Back to your sample characteristics slide, you can see how the population breaks down, right? So you can compare the overlap between this study and the population in your school or district. Similarly, you can see that it's rural and suburban. So if you're an urban school district, you immediately know right now that this particular study is not going to qualify for Tier 1 because you're not going to have both population and setting overlap. But maybe another study will have that. So you may qualify for Tier 1 based on some other study, but you're not going to qualify for Tier 1 based on this study. All right? So I could show you additional examples, which would be nice, but again, I've highlighted those attributes of the website in the slides that we're providing you. So you can go back and review those and look at this recording. And then we've also built in another cheat table for you around the Works Clearinghouse, which is this table right, sorry, I think it's at the beginning of the presentation, or it's at the beginning of this section. Let me find it real quick for you because it is kind of important. One other thing I wanted to point out is that there are intervention reports in the Works Clearinghouse. There's another tab next to the sample characteristics tabs that discuss intervention reports. And the importance of these are that they have contextual information that go beyond just evidence level and the criteria for ESSA, right? They're going to have program information like implementation and cost, et cetera. In the first presentation, we discussed the importance of going beyond the evidence criteria, and this intervention report is going to have additional information for you. The other resource in Works Clearinghouse I want to discuss real quick are the educator practice guides. We went into them in a little bit of detail, but once again, I do want to show you some aspects of them so that you can quickly determine if they are useful to you. So I'm going to share my screen once again. Second monitor, okay. All right, so if you go to the main menu of the Works Clearinghouse and you go to Find Evidence and go to Educator Practice Guides, you will see all of these different manuals that aggregate research across very specific practices. We talked about them last week. The first criteria for meeting the practice guides is that they, for meeting the requirements of the tiers, is that the guides are actually new enough to meet the criteria. For Tier 3, it doesn't matter how old the guides are. All right, so any of these practices could qualify for Tier 3, even these ones written as far back as August 2008. However, in order to qualify for Tiers 1 or Tier 2, the guide needs to be written later than September 2011. And this is embedded, once again, in the PowerPoint that you have. So for purposes of qualifying for Tier 1 or Tier 2, you want to look for October 2018 or later practice guides. And so October 2011 or later. So you see a number that are not going to qualify, but then starting at this row, you see that all of these practice guides here are going to have research that qualifies for Tiers 1 and Tier 2. So if I just open up one of them, I'm going to go into Preventing Dropout in Secondary Schools, which I've already opened. Actually, let me go into it here first, the landing page. The clue that I showed you in the first webinar is that any study that has at least moderate evidence or strong evidence is going to qualify for at least Tiers 1, 2, or 3. The PowerPoint describes how these evidence ratings map to the other tiers. All right, so for purposes of determining Tier 1 or Tier 2, you're going to be looking at these evidence ratings, and the PowerPoint will show you in detail how you do that. The other thing I want to point out is that you do need to have, there are specific requirements around the sample overlap, the sample and settings. So I wanted to show you how to find those in the practice guide. So I'm going to go into the practice guide here, which I've already opened. So when you actually open the practice guide, you're going to see each of the recommendations, which are the same thing as practices described. And one important thing you're going to need to note is that for each practice, there are a number of steps outlined. So I'm looking at practice 3 here, recommendation 3, and you see that step 1 for this practice has to do with directly connecting schoolwork to students' options after high school. Practice 2, or step 2 rather, is provide curriculum programs, all right? So when you're mapping and when you're matching the practice that you want to do and the practices that are in this guide, you need to look at the steps described for each practice and make sure that you're actually doing all the steps. And if you're doing all the steps, then you know that the practice you're considering actually matches the practice that is being described in these guides here. But when you're looking at the sample and the setting, specifically you need to look at Appendix D. All right, so Appendix D of these guides is sorted by recommendation. Right, so for recommendation 3 in Appendix D, we see different studies listed for each row, and then we see a column that describes the participants, the settings, and the outcomes. So here for participants and the student population, you're going to see grade span. And then for settings, you might see middle schools, you will often see rural, urban, etc. And the key here is that these two columns are going to need to align with the criteria for the different evidence tiers, all right? All right, so we just have a few minutes left, and then I want to get to some questions. I know I've blown through a lot of these criteria real quickly, but you do have the maps. So I want to go back to the presentation real quick and just describe what some other clearinghouses were, and then open it up for questions. So in the PowerPoint, you're going to find a map, a crosswalk like this for each of 4 or 5 different clearinghouses, right? The next website I want to show you real quick is called Social Programs at Work, that focuses on research in physical, mental health, early childhood, violence, drug abuse, prevention, etc. Different things that may be related to the chronic absenteeism measure that's so important in your guys' system. And for each website, you're going to see a similar format where we provide the rating that this particular clearinghouse describes, right? So the Social Programs at Work website is going to break the ratings down to top tier, near top tier, and suggestive tier. And then we're going to show you what information you need to look for in order to map the research, the rating of the clearinghouse to the ESSA tier. So in other words, if you find a study in this particular clearinghouse that has a top tier rating, then you are going to need to look for the sample size in the study. If it has a large sample size, then it meets tier 1. If not, then it meets tier 3. If the clearinghouse rating is near top tier, you know it automatically meets tier 3, and it's not going to meet any other higher tier. If you see that it has a suggestive tier rating, then you know it's not going to meet tier 1, 2, or 3 in the ESSA ratings. And just to show you this website really quickly, and then we'll open it up to questions. This is the Social Programs at Work website. And I already said that the key criteria we're looking for is around sample size. And for this particular website, you could go into the K through 12 education program area, for example. And there you will find different interventions rated by tier, right? Top tier or near top tier. And I showed you how those tiers are addressed in the tables that we provided. For this particular website, if you go into a given intervention and you go into the evaluation methods section, here you're going to find sample size information. Okay? You're going to scroll down, and in the overview of the study design, look at this. The study randomly assigned 1,764 students, right? So there you have information that it's a random controlled trial, right? If it says the study randomly assigned, it's a good chance it's a random controlled trial, even though you actually didn't have to look for that for this particular study, because that's already embedded in the rating that the clearinghouse gave this particular study. It has that information along with the sample size, which is larger than 350 students, right? So then we know, going back to our table here, that for the Social Programs at Work websites, because the Career Academy was top tier, and because it had a large sample, it qualifies for ESSA tier number 1, all right? So we have some other examples embedded in the actual slides. So you'll actually be able to follow along with the slides and just look at the screenshots that'll show you how to navigate to the different sections of a couple of more websites that have been mapped. Not all of the clearinghouses that we've shown you have been mapped to the ESSA tiers, but the ones that have been mapped to the ESSA tiers, we give you in the PowerPoint. So if you're not getting into the PowerPoint, unfortunately, you know that there hasn't been a formal mapping to the ESSA tiers. So the ones in the PowerPoint are definitely good to use. So we're running out of time, so I just want to jump to the next steps. just to review, remember that for any given CSI or TSI school, we know that you can find these different evidence-based practices in these online clearinghouses. You can review research studies individually if you have an advanced level of ability for reviewing. You can also contact the IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, who will do single study reviews, and they have a queue for that. So you will need to get on the ball early for that one, like now probably, if you want to use it in a reasonable amount of time. You're going to want to ensure that the study at least meets Tier 3, all right? Review Webinar 1 if you haven't seen that one already to make sure at least meeting the compliance requirements. But look for those Tier 1 and Tier 2 studies because you know that by doing so, you're going to look for a fit with your student population and your student setting, and you're going to have more rigorous results that demonstrate a causal relationship as opposed to just a correlational relationship, which may not be and probably is not causal. And finally, the broader point I wanted to make that we started Webinar 2 with is that remember that this is just one decision you're making when you're looking at selecting evidence-based practices for your schools. There's a number of other decisions that need to be made. Not only does a practice have to have evidence that backs it up, but you need to have a demonstrated need for the school, right? Through local needs assessments or some other way of determining your needs. You need to have the capacity to implement that practice. You need to have the supports in place to implement the practice. So we glossed over it here in this webinar, but remember to look at this, a tool like the hexagon tool here, which Minnesota has been using for some time to really put the evidence decision in its proper context. All right, I know I've thrown a lot at you here today, but I just want to open it up for questions now or any additional context setting from Minnesota or my team as far as what questions you have. Again, you're going to get all the materials emailed to you very shortly. You'll have more examples from additional clearinghouses. And for each clearinghouse, you're going to have a table. And we're going to put all those tables into a cheat sheet. We're going to put all these crosswalk tables into one single cheat sheet. So you'll be able to look at specific clearinghouses and very quickly say, oh, okay, if it has this rating, then I know that I need to look for sample size or something else. And once I do that, I can determine if it meets the ESSA tiers. All right, I'm going to stop talking and give you guys just a couple more minutes to ask any questions. No? Okay. It's not crazy if you don't have questions, but you will probably have questions as you get into this. So let me just pose a question real quickly. Maybe that could be the basis of any other further conversation, which was, what was the most useful thing that you found about today's presentation? If you could please chat that, or you can even say it out loud, even though I'm predicting that won't happen. Just give us an idea of what you found most useful today. This isn't a full evaluation of the presentation we gave you. We will get one of those in due time, but just do us a favor and chat. What was the most useful thing for you today? I know that there is some urgency to getting these materials for you guys because your school improvement plans are due like now. So that is definitely on everybody's radar, and all this stuff will be coming to you ASAP. All right, so there's one question about the practice guides, and I'm going to reinforce a point that I alluded to, which is about, do all the critical elements of the practice guide need to be implemented in order to be evidence-based? So there's a couple of questions embedded in here. So one clarifying point I want to make is that the term evidence-based does not mean Tier 1, 2, or 3. All right, if you mean tier 1, 2, or 3, then we just need to qualify that by saying evidence-based practice that qualifies for tiers 1, 2, or 3, which I assume is what you're talking about. Evidence-based could also mean it meets tier 4, etc. So, but when we talk about meaning the 3 tiers, we do mean that the specific steps under the practice have been followed. And so real quickly, I will show you one slide that gets at that while we have a couple of minutes. So looking at this slide, I'm noting here that for each recommendation, there are a number of action steps that are included in the guide that must be met in order for the evidence rating to be met. In other words, there was a panel that looked at all this research, and they said, if somebody's comparing what they're doing to this research, they need to make sure that what they're doing at least follows these minimum steps in order to consider what they're doing equivalent to the research that we're evaluating here. So I've collapsed the steps here, but again, when you go into the practice guide, you'll find these steps noted for each recommendation, or the recommendation is the same thing as a practice in this case. And so yeah, it's important that each of those recommendations or each of those steps are followed. Let me see what else we have. You referred to recommendations. Yes. Yeah, that's tricky. The word recommendation is the same thing as practice when you go into the educator practice slides. Yeah, wow. Everybody really wants these slides. They're going to be emailed to you ASAP. That's the best I can say right now. And I think that even means that it's going to happen like within the next hours as opposed to days. But that's when we get them to Minnesota, and then they'll get them to you. So rest assured it is an urgent priority. Yeah, so Minnesota talked about MERS already. If Minnesota wants to address any more MERS questions, you can, but I also see that there's some chats. Just to clarify, there will be a link to the recorded webinar that's emailed to you guys, right? So in this email blast that goes out to you guys, there will be the handouts, there will be the presentations, there will be the record. You will get too much stuff, right? You're going to get like, I don't know, 10 things or something. It's going to be overwhelming, but you're going to have everything you need, including the tables, recorded webinars, etc. So looking at the poll questions, some of the things you guys found useful were around the selection criteria and how to look for them. And I know we're at time, so I'm going to wrap this up in 2 seconds. Exploring the Works Clearinghouse in depth was helpful. Looking more closely at the IES guide, great. Knowing that a crosswalk resource is coming, yeah. Use that crosswalk resource. I showed you how to step through one of them. Just apply the same steps for each of them, for each of the online clearinghouses that you're going to receive. All right, so if there's any more questions, I do need to wrap it up because we're at time. If there's any more questions about MERS, like it seems like there's a conversation that's continuing about it potentially, I would say go ahead and discuss that directly with the staff online. I know that you guys know Greg and Dennis, so please reach out to them for any more clarification on that. You can also copy us on those emails. They would be able to give you a more direct answer around alignment with the tiers. Yeah, so feel free to continue that conversation directly with them. And yeah, not seeing any more questions. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to the Minnesota staff, Greg and Dennis. Thanks for being here as always. And thanks to my colleagues working behind the scenes. And thanks to all the participants. We hope you got something worthwhile out of it. And please contact us at the email information at the end of the presentation if you have any more questions.